I'm super excited. These are four very distinct individuals, four different investment horizons, very impressive business people and careers on stage here, and I urge you to try to grab them if you can in the lobby to chat. I wanted to start with a brief poll because you all represent such different ways of coming to football. Raise your hand if your ultimate goal here is to make money with your investments. Okay, so I ask because I just recently interviewed one of Egypt's richest people who owns Aston Villa, Nassef Sawiris, and he said, anyone who tells you football, anyone who does football, invests in football and says this is pure investment, in 95% of the case, he's a liar. It's a passion, it's addictive, and it can ruin your weekend and the following week. So, Joseph, how did you come to football? Can you give us yours as someone who owns multiple clubs now? You're an investor, you have a hedge fund, you're an activist. How did you come into football, and how did you grow your portfolio?
Well, thanks for having me here, Arash. By the way, I subscribe to both. You know, initially you go in, you want to make money, but it is addictive and it ruins your weekends, and it has all sorts of side effects which are surprising. I got into football in a very odd way. I've always made investments in throughout Latin America, and at some point I was approached by some Colombian investors to take a very, very small stake in the historical club of Bogotá, Millonarios, and it was at the time when those clubs were essentially being privatized. If you remember, in the 90s, the Colombian government nationalized a number of Colombian clubs that belonged to the narcos, and then later they tried to sort of privatize them. And so I got involved, and unfortunately, some of the people I got involved with, you know, at this point, my wife would raise her eyebrows and say, you know, what were you thinking? But anyway. Some of those people themselves, you know, got into financial difficulties, and actually one of them was involved in one of the biggest financial scandals of Colombia. And anyway, what ensued was a complicated situation at the club, and to clean it up with the help of the Colombian government, we went through a massive capital increase, and that's actually how I ended up owning one of the biggest clubs in Colombia. And it was a bit of a fluke. I started looking into it, realized that actually, you know, it was an interesting business. You could make it into an interesting business. My lesson from that particular investment is that you need time. It takes time to turn things around, particularly on a situation like that. That was quite complicated and difficult at first.
And then how did you acquire you have 2 or 3 other clubs now? So how did you?
Well, my main investment is really RC Lens, which is a French football club. Initially, I bought it. It was a second division. And the idea was sort of a turnaround, a bit like what we did with Millonarios, different country, different context, different type of financials. But that was also the idea to sort of take a club that was in L2 and then bring it into L1 and make the necessary investments on a brand that had been neglected for a number of years, and eventually do better with it.
And Lens is now in the Champions League. It's a success story. But tell us about your experience in Italy, which.
Well, Italy's been a bit more complicated because that's a much smaller investment. Third division, Serie C, Padova. I'm still hoping to get into Serie B. It's taking a bit longer than I would have thought.
Okay, so that's effectively a portfolio, Champions League team, and platform. Michel, you are a relative newcomer to the world of football, and your investment thesis is very distinct, but it's something we've been waiting to see play out, and I think you're now one of the biggest actors in this space. So can you tell us how you came to football, why you have a very firm thesis around women's football, and what you've been up to?
So yeah, it's been slightly less than 2 years. I guess I call myself sort of an accidental fan and an investor and an app owner. I got exposed to women's soccer in 2019 when U.S. Women's national team won the World Cup, and I live in D.C., so there was a lot of celebration. And quite frankly, at that time, I didn't even know there was a professional women's league, let alone Washington Spirit, which is a NWSL professional team in the US. And I got exposed. I was invited to participate as a sort of a passive investor. And at that time, US women's soccer went through a lot of growing pains and scandals and so forth. So as a business person, understanding some of the issues, I wanted to help to solve some of those issues. And initially, I had no intention of buying or investing, but as I understood more about soccer and especially women's sports, I not only became passionate, but I became a believer that this has an incredible business, commercial viability, and with the right level of investment and focus, there is no reason why this cannot grow, perhaps not at the Premier League level, but something aspiring. We can aspire to grow that level, but significant business potential. So just like I did in my other business world, I just jumped right in.
Yeah, and you absolutely have made an impact. So you've got the Washington team. You bought the Lionesses here in London. And tell us about your deal with Olympique Lyon, because that is, one of the premier women's teams. And tell us about how you came to that, how you structured it, because I think you have a real novel approach to how you're growing your empire in women's football.
How many French are in this room?
There's a few.
Okay, I'll be nice. OL Feminine is probably the team in the women's football. I don't think there is any team that has won as many trophies as OL Fem has done. I think they're a trailblazer. So if I wanted to build a women's multi-club and make a point, I couldn't think of any better team to start with from the top. Because I think one of the biggest issues in women's sports is an awareness. A lot of people I was not aware. A lot of people don't even know that there's professional league. They think it's just hobby, charity, and that type of thing. So I think there are a lot of issues, especially just like in England, actually not even most, all teams are men and women together under one ownership. And you can imagine that, I don't blame the owners because financially and commercially, men's teams bring 99% of the revenue. So of course, your focus is going to be on men's team. And women's teams have been kind of viewed, not just France and England, everywhere around the world, as sort of charity or somebody's pet project or ESG or DEI, depending on which country you live in, different acronyms. But so that's a very, very hard transition to think about women's team being separate from men. But I think for a women's team to be successful and achieve the commercial viability, in my opinion, women's teams should have a separate and dedicated focus, not necessarily the ownership-wise, but absolutely have a dedicated focus, not same staff supporting both men and women. That means those staff will not have time to support women. So absolutely dedicated focus, not only on the sports side, but also the business side. And so the separation is going to be very important. So just like any other business issues, when you're trying to do something for the first time that people never imagine that could be possible, it takes time. And I think that's the first step for women's sports to take to the next level. And it was challenging, but it was well worth it. And I really appreciated that. I have to say, along my about 9-month journey in France, I met everywhere I went, both men and women came up to me in France, said that how grateful they are, how excited they are that things like this is happening in France. It's about time, and that's really what gets me going.
And you are trying to make a financial return in the long term?
Absolutely.
Okay. Mark, you are a successful investor. You've been in sort of finance for a long time. You took over the Milwaukee Brewers in 2005 with some buddies. How did you come to football, and how did you convince Delia, who we are all huge fans of, to let you into her club?
I came into football because over the years I've been very good friends with the folks who own Fenway Sports. They have a significant interest in Liverpool, and I watched from afar the terrific success they had and started looking at English football clubs probably 10 years ago. Never really had the right match. We try to use them as a paradigm with the management team that we have in Milwaukee. The focus both on financial financial expertise and analytics, sporting analytics, to have success in sports, and was curious to compete in the most competitive league in the world. And we actually had a reverse inquiry from Delia's bankers, who there was a selling shareholder of 15.96%, and they were looking for a group that could buy that. Michael Folger was his name, he was the director, buy his shares and sort of assist from a management standpoint, and in particular with an interest in sports and sporting expertise. So we went through a pretty rigorous interview process, and we're very happy they chose us. And we went from there. Our goal is to, first of all, I would say there's huge comparison between Norwich City and Milwaukee. Passionate fan community, smaller market that punches way above its weight, a lot of success. Norwich, it was intriguing that they moved up and down, yo-yo, I guess you call it,
Yep.
the Premier League, much as in baseball when I bought the Brewers. Actually, this is different. Norwich has had a lot of success. When I brought the Brewers, they had 12 losing seasons in a row and were last place. And since then, we've had 7 playoff appearances and I think 3rd or 4th most wins in the league from that point forward. And that's where it started. One of the things that strikes me about Delia and Michael, they have been, in 28 years, they've been to all but 3 away matches. So talk about passion. And that passion is addictive, so we're all in.
And so how much do you own now of Norwich City?
So we had a shareholder vote that brought us to co-majority ownership with Delia at 40.3%. We're still doing some of the financial paperwork. I think we heard from the regulators before. I can attest that the process is appropriate and rigorous. And once that's documented, will be official.
All right. And just a reminder, by the way, I've got an iPad here. If you're watching at home, you can send in questions. Don't forget to use the hashtag FTFootball. And I'll come to the audience in about 20 minutes for questions. So please do start thinking of what you want to ask the team. Alistair, Arctos has made a huge wave in sports. And in terms of driving valuations, you guys are now one of the major players, besides foreign governments, lifting the prices of things in the market. Tell us a little bit about the football portfolio and then how you had the courage to go for this big PSG deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I join my fellow panelists in categorically answering the question of whether football can become a business with an affirmative yes. I think our center of gravity is North America. It has always been. It'll continue to be the principal focus of ours. But the tagline of this conference is the path to profitability. Well, the path to profitability in North America is a very well-trodden one. Over 98% of the teams make money. Over 50% have 20% plus operating margins. And so we've seen that it can be a very successful business. It's obviously a different economic paradigm in European football. You have to try harder to unearth gems, but we apply the same objective, rigorous, criteria-driven approach to isolating best-in-class teams and what we think are franchises that are poised for growth in North America to European football. We just customize it for proprietary assets that we think give teams a unfair competitive advantage. Now, in Europe, that could be your academy operations, player trading capabilities, obviously the strength of your team. It could be your brand strength, and then stadium infrastructure. Do you have an existing setup, or is there a near-term catalyst where you can grow into a larger development? And to give you a sense as to how much that limits the investable universe and how restrictive those criteria are, we think of the top 200 clubs in Europe, something like 10 to 15 are investable. So it's less than a 5% total addressable market for us.
Investable meaning?
Investable, attractive opportunities that we can then try to structure transactions around and build strategic partnerships with the owners of those teams. And then the question becomes, can we do that?
Because the entire strategy is around buying minority stakes, right?
Minority stakes, yeah. And
Not
can
looking for
we
control.
We don't believe that we can control or operate a business better than what we think are already best-in-class operators. So it'll always be a minority franchise strategy. But that approach gives us the chance to have a conversation and prove our strategic capabilities to a handful of owners. And since we got started with Arctos 4 years ago, we've been able to strike 4 different investment partnerships Three of them are publicly disclosed, so we own Liverpool indirectly through Fenway Sports Groups, Atalanta in Serie A with Steve Paliuca and some Bain partners, and then more recently Paris Saint-Germain in partnership with QSI. All three very different assets, but all went through the same rigorous, singular process to identify them as attractive opportunities. And we all think they're poised for growth for different reasons.
Can you elaborate a little bit on PSG? Because when that asset comes to mind, I don't really think about profits. I think about something else. So
yeah, well, happy to. Look, at the terms and the transaction structure and the valuation of our deal, it has to stay between us and QSI. It's not appropriate for me to comment on that. But look, suffice to say, it satisfied our return criteria while justifying the dilution that QSI had to take to bring us on board as a partner. The thesis for Paris Saint-Germain is multifold and actually pretty simplistic. There is an incredible academy operation there. They have built an academy and a training center, and they've invested over 350 million euros into those facilities that we think has no parallel in global football. It sits on top of the most prolific catchment area for talent in global football. And the combination of those assets, combined with a avowed commitment to become more sustainable and to move away from a star-driven Galacticos culture to a younger, hungrier, more French-oriented team, gives you a very good combination of factors and a unlock for financial efficiency. And you can see it in the data now. I mean, that PSG was the youngest team in the knockout stages of the Champions League this year. I'm sure that is a surprise to a lot of people, but it's an incredible statistic. There's also a huge potential around the stadium, and we've seen this at large across our American portfolio. Chicago Cubs in Major League Baseball, Sacramento Kings, Utah Jazz in the NBA, Tampa Bay Lightning in the NHL, all have built or are building these transformative mixed-use real estate development anchored by sports stadia. And the chance for PSG to do that in the Parisian suburbs is a very strong one. It's a process that's live. We're working actively with them on it, and I think it was a key strategic imperative for them in taking us on as a capital provider as well. They've sold out the Parc des Princes for 150 consecutive games, the highest revenue per seat in European football. There's a lot of unmet demand that they could satisfy with a new development, and it could transform a community. And then finally, and this is where it gets simplistic, right? There's only one team, one large team in Paris, and so there's an effective monopoly over one of the most visited cities in the world. And that has led to a brand strength that we think has achieved escape velocity from the league itself. There aren't that many franchises that have been able to do that in the past, and there certainly aren't many that have that monopoly over a city as important as Paris. It's rare in European football, but it's very rare in global sports as well.
Joseph, one of the great unresolved debates in ownership of football is multi-club, and you've scraped together a multi-club system by all means. I mean, does it work? Is it a real thing? Do you believe in it? Is this something you recommend our fellow panelists to pursue, a sort of multi-club ownership? Are there real synergies?
Well, I think I'm a sort of accidental multi-club owner, so it wasn't done on purpose. It just came about, as I made some other investments in those countries, and so I wasn't looking to extract synergies. I've tried since then. I mean, I've now owned the Colombian club for more than 10 years, and Lens now, I'm going on my 8th year. So I did try to sort of extract some synergies. I think it's very difficult. I think for multi-club ownership to work, in terms of extracting synergies, first of all, you need to have a central sort of sports director, someone who coordinates all the clubs and who basically runs the sports divisions of every single club. To run clubs the way I do, which is, each club is run as a business on its own, it's very difficult to get people talking to one another. then there needs to be some sort of, for the synergies to be extracted, there needs to be some sort of cultural affinities. Frankly, between Colombia and northern France, it's a tough one. And you know, also Italian football is quite closed in some ways. So it is difficult to get those people talking to one another, literally, you know, even from a language barrier perspective. If you look at what Red Bull's done, you know, between Leipzig and Salzburg, you know, they're very close physically, it's the same culture. In some ways, you could use one club as your B team and still be competitive in a smaller league. It all makes sense. You know, for instance, if I was looking for multi-club ownership and extracting synergies, maybe sort of a club in Belgium would be a nice fit with Lens, which sits just across the border. For Colombia, maybe a club in Mexico or an MLS club where they're big consumers of Colombian football players, or even Colombian football players do well in Spain as a sort of a first step into the European markets. You could imagine those types of combinations. My club ownership doesn't really work or doesn't lend itself to that, but that's fine. I mean, I'm not you know, looking to extract synergies from that standpoint. I also think, frankly, there's just so many football players around. You know, to sort of say, no, it has to be from this academy or it has to come from, you know, this club. You're making it difficult when there's literally tens of thousands of football players, you know, around to pick from.
Michelle, how does this apply to women's football?
Yeah, so apparently I'm the first who's doing it in the women's sports. And I know some of the multi-club concept is being viewed not so positively, but for women's sports, I would submit to you that it's actually a necessity rather than a luxury or a choice. Because there's so much investment needed. So one of the first things that I'm doing and what's needed is actually training women players as women. Right now, a lot of team sports basically borrow their training manuals and performance manuals from men's teams, in part because there is no data about women. 94% of all sports and performance-related research and science data are dedicated to men. So there's not enough data for women. In the meantime, with little exaggeration, almost all ACL injuries happen during players' menstruation period. The day before your menstruation starts, you're 7 times more likely to get injured. So we're beginning to find out, but they're not reflected in how we train players and how we play and then schedule all those things. So I decided that that's the first area that I'm going to invest. And I have right now over 20 people, and the number is growing, just dedicated to the area, including research as well as the practical training, and number is going to grow. I may be crazy, but it's going to be impossible to do that for one team. But if you do this for across multi-teams, you can do it once and make it available to all other teams, right? So there's a scale that female football teams need, especially in the training areas. Even when I first arrived at OL, despite the fact that it was the best team, they had basically 11 dedicated sports staff, including head coaches, assistant coaches. So the performance area was basically neglected. So the first thing within weeks was we increased that number from 11 to 26. Now we have almost 1-to-1 ratio between players and the performance staff. So I want to really invest where it's needed. Data analytics, we saw a lot of data this morning, but there's a lot of data analytics. When we hired the coach for the Spirit, we actually ran a very extensive data analysis of every coach in the world. And the number one was actually the one that we ended up hiring. So data analysis, there's significant investment needed. To do that for one team where our revenue, even the highest revenue, I think, even in the US, is probably single 10 million, the 10 million range. I think Angel City probably has the highest, over 20, 30 million. So it's very difficult. So the scale is very important for women's sports, for investment. The other thing is actually acceleration. So the women's sports, especially football, is taking off in the US, England, Spain, and France. But over, if I'm not mistaken, something like 6 billion people in this world are either watching or playing soccer. So it's not just the US, England, English, and French phenomenon. There are a lot more people outside these countries that are playing soccer and wanting to be the next Alex Morgan, Sam Kerr, and all that. And I want them to grow up, all the girls to grow up. This is not something that they watch on TV, and this is like only available in France and England and the US, but it's in their backyard. So I want to buy teams in those countries and make this advanced data analytics and performance, all those things available in those countries so that the girls in those countries can say, I can have it, I can grow up to be I can aspire, just like my next door can aspire to be the next Messi and so forth, because the playing and training environment will be the comparable. So when you accelerate and that becomes a much more global phenomenon, and that has significant impact on media dollars, which is right now almost zero for any women's team. Transfer market is going to grow almost nothing right now. So this is all related, but at the end of the day, I think it's trying to build scale and acceleration so that the women's sports can take off and have the commercial viability.
And just very quickly, you've also invested in a shoe company.
Yeah, so another area, one of the major things is the hormonal and the women's body biology and physiology, but the other thing, apparently the contributing factor that I learned is the boots, right, the cleats. And traditionally they were made out of basically men's feet mold and made it a little narrower or whatever. But apparently the weight distribution of how female players play, all those things are very different. So I ran into actually an English woman entrepreneur, but soccer passionate and player, who started a company that actually start using female feet as a mold and start making female dedicated and focused boots. And I also invested in women's sports only media, just women's sports. IDA is the other sports that making women. So the whole multi-club thing is not just about teams, but it is investing in overall ecosystem, so that it's not just the teams, but we need to bring all other necessary components, including research and science, so that this is going to reach a sort of a tipping point to get to be a global phenomenon. So that. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's super interesting. Mark, you've obviously owned the Brewers for a long time. You've dealt with a passionate fan base. Football is something else. Tell us about how deep you're discovering these guys, or maybe share that story about the AGM with the fans sound like better financial analysts than most of the people on Wall Street.
Yes, we have among the more passionate fans in Major League Baseball, but I think that Norwich City fans are, first of all, a number of them are shareholders. We have, I think, over 6,000 fans who are shareholders. In the United States, the only paradigm for that really is the Green Bay Packers. But the Green Bay Packers, it's sort of ceremonially hang it on the wall. The share doesn't mean anything per se. It does allow the Packers to raise money for the team. Here, the shareholders at Norwich City, they have a vote. They have a financial stake, and they certainly have a say. So my very first AGM, which is last year, I'd literally been an investor for, I think, 6 weeks. A fan got up and sitting like right near the front, or actually I should say an owner. And he said, Mr. Attanasio, thank you so much for making the trip to Norwich and for investing in our club. We're very happy to have you here. And then he paused and said, however, when you hear the however, and one of our investments went in as a preferred stock to build an aquatic center, a training center that's somewhat state-of-the-art for not only our main team players, but first team players, but for the academy players. And as I started to explain to him in a room that was about this size, the difference, and his concern with the preferred stock was that the interest rate on it was going to cripple the club. I started to give a little bit of a Wall Street lecture on the difference between debt and preferred stock, and that was not going over. And so I quickly pivoted and said, but I would never do anything to hurt the club, and everybody clapped. So that was a good introduction to what the approach needs to be, and I think even more so, I've said for for almost 2 decades now in Milwaukee that our family was a steward for the club. We weren't really owners. We were the Selig family. Bud Selig was the commissioner of baseball for, longest serving commissioner, and before that, he'd owned the team for 34 years. We're coming up in year 20, and at some point, another family will own the team, or will steward the team. And that couldn't be more true in English football. I think Delia was looking for a group that would be stewards she could hand the club to. And one of the things that we've really focused on in Norwich is how to work closely with her and the management team there, which, by the way, is an excellent management team. And I'd say relative to women's sports, we have a women majority owner and a woman president of business, which is one of the things that attracted me to the team and I'm very proud of.
A couple questions coming in on the iPad. How do you balance this need for keeping the fans happy with sort of keeping the club profitable or, close to profitable and sustainable?
So the very first match I saw when I was doing diligence on the club, we were in the Premier League and we played Tottenham. And the first half was sort of close, and then Tottenham decided to try a little harder, and then it was 5-1. And there was a lot of media then about how, questions from fans that the management at Tottenham said they needed to run the business to break even, that whatever money they made, they would put back in, but they wouldn't look to have losses. And I think that's what we've done in Milwaukee is had a sustainable team for 19 seasons. As I said, a third or fourth most wins out of 15 teams in the National League. We need to be, in the championship, virtually every team, I believe, loses money. I was looking at your grid and your materials there. And some of that, by the way, the financial fair play rules, what's considered discipline is having, 75% of your, limiting your player payroll to 75% of revenues. Well, for at least U.S. sports, once you're over 50%, you lose money. So almost the model is to lose money here, and if you dig into a big debt hole, it's very hard to climb out. So I think at least for championship clubs, it's important to continue to develop and sell players. And that's the model we brought in. Ben Napper was the loan manager at Arsenal. He was quite adept at developing and then selling players and bringing in others, and that's what he'll be doing in Norwich.
Alistair, coming to you, and maybe we'll take one question from the audience in a second, but one more from the iPad. I mean, there's a few questions here about how important is real estate, and again, as a minority partner, how do you unlock real estate opportunities? How can you help as a sort of junior partner at the table in these clubs?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, again, Mark can attest that real estate expansion and sports-anchored real estate in North America has just been a huge contributor to the commercial revenue profile of teams, leagues, and communities in the past. And there are idiosyncrasies that you need to manage by state, but it's typically quite accommodative. And municipalities fear teams moving states. They fear relocation. None of that exists in Europe. There are idiosyncrasies that can be frustrating, and as a result, you have to work harder for that development. But when it becomes possible, we typically think that is a chance for the management team to really put their foot on the gas. And we have helped our teams build, conceive, and finance multiple different large-scale developments.
We actually having a footprint outside of football and in other sports as well.
In other sports as well. I mean, these I could go through countless examples, but to give you one in Major League Baseball last season, I think there were 10 weekends where teams hosted more than 1.5 million people on the weekend. So I mean, these. I hesitate to call them consumers because it's often a mistake that North American investors make in coming to European football. But these fans, need more amenities. They need more to bring them, to convince their families to come and to come before the match and come after the match. And that unmet demand has been met at large in North America. And so I think even though we're a minority, we've just seen so many precedent examples of success, seen how transformative it can be from the community. And we've actually built through investments into strategic partnerships to real brands and real companies that can help go inside teams, which is what we're doing with Paris Saint-Germain, and advise them on their next steps.
Can I take one really quick question right here in the audience, and then we'll need to wrap up?
I'm Sophie Butcher from Amazon Advertising. So I'd love to understand from your perspective how the brands you partner with through sponsorships and other avenues help you achieve financial success, and to what extent does the cultural impact you might achieve together through campaigns feed into that? And if yes, what factors do you therefore consider for these partnerships before you start them?
Okay, so I guess the question is sort of how do you work with sponsors and maybe Joseph, you have a lot of different.
Yeah, no, I mean, I found sponsors, sort of local sponsors. Essentially, it's a very local business as far as my clubs are concerned. And you know, when I got into Lens, for instance, there was very powerful local family in northern France. They're actually one of the wealthiest families in France. They own a lot of brands, mostly in the retail sector. And you know, I struck a deal with them, and it was a good deal for me while I was in the second division, and it became a great deal for them when they got into the first division. And it's become a long-term partnership, so much so that last year they decided to invest in the club. And I would say that's sort of the ideal type of partnership, long-term partnership that you try and establish with brands and with not just brands and companies, but also local fans. You know, you sort of you know, it's a give and take, and it has to be, you know, over a very long period of time, and you have to show that, you know, you're committed to investing, but at the same time that you also expect some response from the local, you know, population.
Okay, maybe one last. I asked these guys whether they thought they were going to make money in football. Do you guys think these guys will make money in football? Let's see a show of hands. All right, we'll say that's 40%. Okay, with that, thank you so much. Thank you, guys.